Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the New York Historical Society. I'm Louise Mirrer, New York Historical's president and CEO, and it is a great thrill to see so many of you in our beautiful Robert H. Smith Auditorium this evening. Tonight's program, The President's Barack Obama, is presented as a part of our Presidential Historical Commission here at New York Historical, and it is a David M. Rubenstein President's Series program. Now then, we are thrilled to welcome Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times, to the New York Historical Society this evening. Mr. Baker is also a political analyst for MSNBC, and he is a regular panelist on PBS's Washington Week. Mr. Baker is the author of 4 books, including his most recent, Obama, The Call of History, an authoritative history of the Obama presidency that was published last June. We're also delighted to welcome Douglas Brinkley to New York Historical this evening as our moderator. He's a professor of history at Rice University, a Grammy Award-winning producer, and a best-selling author. Professor Brinkley also serves as presidential historian at the New York Historical Society as well as CNN. And now, please join me in welcoming our speakers to the stage. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening, Peter.
Good evening.
Wonderful to have you here, and your experience and wisdom as New York Times White House correspondent. Tonight's on Barack Obama's presidency in particular, but I wanted to begin by asking you to tell us, was Barack Obama born in the United States? We're going to solve it once and for all tonight here in New York Historical Society.
Well, I have it on great authority that he is, and the great authority, of course, is Donald Trump, who said, who finally said in 2016 that it is in fact the case the president is born in the United States. So, I've gone personally to investigate this in Hawaii, and I think a little more investigation would be called for. So, I may call the travel agent soon, but.
What does Hawaii mean to Barack Obama, do you think?
Hawaii is really fundamental to understanding who he is, I think. We try to one of the things that makes Barack Obama so interesting is we have tried for now more than a decade to fit him into a box, right? To make him understandable to us in one fashion or another. He's either the great progressive hope, or he's the post-partisan centrist, or he is the African-American trailblazer, or he is one of many other things we could define him. Hawaii is integral to understanding because it is so different than the experience you might have in the mainland, right? He's an African-American, but raised by white grandparents for the most part in a school that is multicultural but not particularly black. He writes about this with great poetry in his book, Dreams of My Father, of course. But it makes him, and he's often described as the first Asian president, because in fact, not only did he grow up in the Pacific, but spent some time in Indonesia. So I think to understand him, it's important to remember where he comes from.
What about his connections to Indonesia, as you're mentioning? What is there any lingering, as somebody who's written a book about him, did those childhood years abroad make him look at the United States from a different lens?
I think they do, and they did. Remember, we haven't had a president who grew up overseas in a long time, had experience like that the way he did. So he has seen the United States from the outside. And as anybody who's traveled or spent time overseas understands, that provides a certain clarity of vision that you don't necessarily get living here at home. My wife and I lived in Russia for 4 years, and I tell you, nothing made us appreciate America more than living in Moscow. And I think, obviously, he came away with a great love for the United States as well, but understanding of its importance not just in the Atlantic region, but also in the Pacific region.
You know, there have been so many good books being written about Barack Obama right now, but yours is just stellar, and I recommend it to everybody. But tell us about your personal relationship with the president. When did you first meet Barack Obama?
Yeah, I went out with him on the campaign trail in 2008. I wasn't one of the regular campaign reporters, but as a White House reporter, I wanted to make sure I got to know whoever was coming next, right? And every president has an origin theory, has a creation myth in effect. How do they get here? And if you only see them once they get to the White House and you don't understand the trials and tribulations, the journey that got them there, you're missing part of the picture. So you have to go out there on the campaign trail as much as you possibly can to see what life is like for them on their road to the White House. So I went out and spent a little bit of time with him there. But I didn't really get to know him at all until 2009, once he was in the White House. We had a number of interviews with him and other encounters with him. And he's a lot what you see. I mean, he is a smart, engaging, nuanced person. He is reserved. He is not hail fellow, well met. He's not like Bill Clinton or George W. Bush in that sense. He would come to the back of the plane and say hi, but it wasn't for chit chat. He didn't come back and say, hey, how's the family doing? What's going on with your newsroom or something like that. If he came back, it was because he had a message to deliver. Usually he thought your story wasn't very good and he wanted to make sure you understood that. He had some other points to make, but he was an all-business guy. I remember one time I went in for an interview in the Oval Office, and it was for the New York Times Magazine, so it was meant to be more expansive, more introspective. It wasn't meant to be like boom, boom news. And we sit down and he says, okay, go. Like that was his thing with us, go. He's all business.
What about, we mentioned Hawaii, Indonesia, now the whole Chicago story. They're building his presidential library there right now, Obama Center. This is his grassroots years. Is there the grassroots organizing side of him, that you think still made a difference when he was president?
Well, look, he was a community organizer, right? That is the fundamental part of his biography. But he graduated into the pantheon of presidents, as you do. You might start off as a local or state or type of politician, but once you get to the White House, you're thinking and living in a different atmosphere, a rarefied atmosphere, of which, of course, as you know, only 40-some people had lived before, and the peers you have around the world are pretty minimal as well. And so he was a figure in history from the moment he was elected. The first line in the first line in his obituary was written the moment he was elected, which he knew. And so, yes, he is a product of the grassroots, but then I think he then transcends that, as any president does.
The first line being that he's their first African-American president.
Absolutely.
And what, he talked about...
Which is both an extraordinary achievement and a curse.
Right.
At the same time, I think, for any president to be weighted with the expectations that come with that.
Yeah, and there's a great letter of that he wrote John Lewis, right when he became president. If not for you, John, meaning if not for Selma and what you did marching over the Pettus Bridge, how did he balance being a civil rights person and all that entails with being a president for all the American people?
That was one of the fundamental challenges for his presidency, right? He understood where he came from. He understood whose shoulders he was brought to the White House on. And in the Oval Office, he put a new rug in, and the rug had the Martin Luther King quote, of course, on it, and he had a Martin Luther King bust, famously, in the Oval Office. But he didn't talk about that much in his first term. Why? He would tell you the answer is because I had a lot going on, right? And he did. He had a financial crisis. He had a couple wars, a few things going on. Fair enough. But I also think, obviously, politics enters into that. He did not want to be seen as an African-American president. He wanted to be seen as a president who happened to be African-American. He did not want to be defined. He did not want us to put him in a box. He hated that. And so he wanted to be a president for all people. If you asked him, in particular, he got a lot of criticism sometimes from African-American leaders or commentators, Tavis Smiley and the like, you haven't done enough for black people, you haven't done enough for African-American. And he would say, look, my programs lift all boats, and the boats that are mostly going to be lifted happen to be from disadvantaged communities, right? If I give a healthcare program for all Americans, the people who mostly don't have, disproportionately don't have healthcare and would be benefited from will be in communities of color and disadvantaged. So that would be his answer. His second term, he got a little more vocal about it. Partly, again, circumstance, right? In his second term, we saw a significant series of anniversaries, right? He went to Selma with John Lewis for the 50th anniversary. He went to the Washington Mall for the anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech, the LBJ Library for the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. but also these terrible, horrific events in Ferguson and in Charlotte and Baltimore and so forth that required any president to speak out on race more. And he became, shed a burden of having to seek re-election. He became a little bit more willing to talk about it, and gave some pretty powerful remarks that I think resonated with a lot of Americans, but unfortunately didn't solve the race issue in the way I think he would have liked.
And not just civil rights in the United States. Nelson Mandela was one of his iconic heroes and somebody he referenced to a lot. You got to go to Africa with President Obama. What was that experience like?
I did, yeah. In July of 2009, his first year, he made a one-day stop. It was just one day. He went to Ghana for a day. And their argument was every other president goes, when they go to Africa, they go for a week or 10 days. We're not going to make it some thing that has to be special. We're going to make it part of the routine. So if I go to Italy, I can also go to Africa, and I don't have to. Well, it didn't work out that way, of course. But he went to Ghana for a day, and we flew. I was the pool. We flew to this the coast where they had the slave embarkation point, and people were lined up. I mean, people always line up for any president, and I went with George W. Bush to Africa, and they lined up for him too, so I don't want to make it out like it doesn't happen for others. But they were, of course, drawn to him in a way that was powerful and palpable. And he and his family, their two daughters and his wife, touring the door of no return, where slaves were sent to the New World, it was just obviously resonated powerfully with anybody who saw that.
And the Mandela connection, what do you think?
He did. Mandela represented Mandela was representative not just of civil rights and a pathbreaker. I think he also sort of admired Mandela for his sort of cool demeanor, his sort of unflappability. I think he saw a little of that in himself. He wanted to emulate that. Somebody who did not hold on to grudges and practice the politics of retribution. That was something I think he aspired to himself. So yeah, he went down to meet with Mandela. He went for Mandela's funeral, and it meant a lot to him.
Now, since we're doing presidential history series here, we're talking about the Nobel Peace Prize. Theodore Roosevelt won one for the Russo-Japanese War, Woodrow Wilson for ending of World War I, and then Jimmy Carter had won one as a post-president for his work on river blindness, guinea worm, et cetera.
Any day now, President Trump will have his.
Yeah, but
it'd be a great reunion meeting. Can you imagine? Get them all together.
Well, how important was the winning of the Nobel? It came early. Some people thought maybe he hadn't done anything to deserve it yet. Yeah. Why did Barack Obama win a Nobel Prize? How important was his speech, and what do you think it means to his presidency?
It's remarkable. It's the only time I have to think in American history in which a Nobel Prize was seen as a political liability. But it was. They didn't expect this. They didn't know it was coming. They suddenly get this message saying, oh, by the way, the president has just won a Nobel Prize. It was within months of turning in office, and he hadn't done anything at that point. And he knew he hadn't done anything at that point. The Nobel Prize was more about aspiration at that point than it was about achievement. And he felt awkward about it. And I think his staff was worried that it would look presumptuous. Remember, of course, John McCain had rather effectively criticized him during the campaign for being sort of this high and mighty, Messiah-like figure, having a great opinion of himself. He appeared at the Denver nominating convention with these great Greek columns as if he was some sort of this new Olympian sent down to us. So they were wary, I think, of the idea of looking presumptuous and claiming some credit that they did not yet feel like they had deserved. And it was coming at a time when he was in the middle of this 10-week review over what to do in Afghanistan. He was about to send more troops, not fewer troops, into war. So that was a complicated thing for him. What he did to square that circle was come up with one of his most memorable speeches in which he talked about the idea of just war, the idea of when war was necessary, and how he was not Martin Luther King. It was not him. He was not Gandhi. He was not King. He was not a pacifist. He was a commander-in-chief, and there was a role for him to play in the use of force for just causes. I don't think it's a message that gets said very often at the Nobel Peace Ceremony. But it was a very memorable speech, and I think one of probably the five or 10 maybe most memorable of his presidency. Is there one of his speeches that if somebody asked you to pick a speech or two perhaps that you think are kind of eternal? Is there one that
you gravitate towards?
That's a great question. You know, the truth is his best speeches were as a candidate as opposed to being a president. I think that, and John Favreau and Cody Keenan, his speech writers will probably kill me for that. But the truth is, when he got on the campaign trail is when we heard the soaring oratory, when we heard the sort of the inspiration. He could take a stadium of 80,000 people and rouse them with the idea, not just the idea of what he would do, but the idea of himself, right? He was selling biography as much as he was selling ideology. And when it came to being in office, he sort of reverted to kind of a more professorial mode, right? No offense, Professor. But he would want to explain things to us in a way that made sure we got it. And sometimes that could be a little pedantic and sometimes a little didactic, and it didn't tend to inspire as much. And when we went to press conferences, you knew the first question had to be a good one because you weren't necessarily going to get a second one. I mean, like he would take 13 out of the 20 minutes you were given for an interview, for instance, on the first question, like, how are you today? Ooh, bad idea. And if you dare to try to interrupt him, he would say, excuse me, I haven't finished yet. And he had 14 points, and he was going to make all of them. So he was a tough interview, but his most inspiring things were actually out on the campaign trail.
And perhaps those grief counselor-in-chief speeches.
Yeah.
Like when he went to Charleston at the AME Church and sang Amazing Grace.
Absolutely.
And I think it's during Obama's presidency, we almost start demanding, or I thought we were demanding of presidents to always be a kind of handholder on these national tragedies. How was he affected by the gun violence issues and having to constantly go to these places like Tucson or?
Well, look, my colleague Maureen Dow once called him Mr. Spock, and there is sort of this, logical, hyperlogical side to him, the Vulcan side of him. But if you remember, Mr. Spock was actually half Vulcan, and he was half human, right? Well, President Obama had a half human side too. And it would come out during especially these moments of great violence. And you can never forget the Newtown school shooting after his reelection in 2012. And he was like anybody would be, so moved by that. And he was in the Oval Office preparing to make some remarks. And his staff told us later that they'd never seen him so unable to compose himself, so distraught. Joe Biden told me, he says, I tried to offer to come out with him so that I could be there by his side when he made the comments because I worried that he would break down. And they was actually told, don't do that, Joe, because actually make him break down even more. And he was very emotional. He did come out to the briefing room. He reacted as a dad, right? As anybody would, thinking about children as he had his own. And tears rolled down his face, and he stopped. He choked up. He couldn't go on for, it was like 5, 6, 7, 8 seconds. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about what a president, it's a lot in presidential terms. And then he would go on, and then he stopped again because he couldn't. So he's very, he had moments of great emotion, even though I think for the most part we remember him as a stoic person.
If we can beam ourselves back to Obama's victory, we had the Great Recession when he won, and our economy was in tatters. And that was really a first line of business. How do you get America up and running again? How did he succeed, and what did he do in his first year that impresses you in the sense of dealing with our economic crisis?
Yeah, congratulations, Mr. President. You get the Great Recession.
Yeah.
That's the prize for all the time you spent on the road campaigning. In fact, in December of 2008, when he had just won one of the very first meetings he has with his advisors is, by the way, sir, actually it's worse than you thought. The economy is heading off the cliff. And look, there is no playbook for this. We had not had anything quite like this before, and the truth is, as you know, as a scholar of FDR, as robust as the New Deal was, it took World War II to genuinely bring us out of the Depression. And so a lot of good things happened because of the New Deal, but he was faced with this incredible dilemma where anything seemed possible. The whole thing could just fall off a cliff. He had a good transition with George W. Bush. Bush was very gracious with him and made that period better than FDR and Hoover, right? But he came into it facing the likelihood that anything bad could happen. He had the auto industry on the edge of collapse. The banking industry was on the edge of collapse. He proposed a stimulus package that was criticized as too much by the Republicans, too little by the liberals. But piece by piece, he began pulling the country back, or at least the country began to come back. How much credit you want to give him versus how much you say it's the economy. will for always be argued. But the economy we see today that President Trump takes credit for the recovery obviously began under his watch and has continued after he left office.
Yeah, and the famous bailout of General Motors, which gets kind of underplayed somewhat. Tell us, what did he do? How did he help save GM?
Well, he was asked, in effect, to basically bail out these two big companies, two of the big three, for all their bad decisions, all of their poor management, poor leadership, poor forecasting of the marketplace. And he came very close to letting Chrysler go down and saying, I may not do it. Eventually, he was convinced that it wasn't just the company that would suffer, but the whole chain effect would ripple through the Midwest because of the supply chains and all the different businesses that were related. So after a series of very difficult meetings, he decided he would invest federal money in saving them. He fired the head of GM and basically took them over. For a while, we owned these large car companies as taxpayers. And it worked. The car companies came roaring back. And by 2012, the bumper sticker for his reelection was, GM is alive and Osama bin Laden is dead. And it was, that was summed up, that was Biden's phrase. He liked that a lot. But it was true. And I think that's one of the things that sealed re-election for him, because he was able to go to the Midwest and say, we've accomplished something here. We pulled back from the brink.
You mentioned Osama bin Laden and his killing. How do you judge President Obama's war on terror and the things that he did? I mean, obviously, as a candidate, the fact that he had been against the war in Iraq was a big boon for him in defeating Hillary Clinton to secure the Democratic nomination. Mm-hmm. Now he's president and has to send troops into Afghanistan and has to be the overlord of our Middle East policy. How did he do that in his first term, and that culminating into the killing of Osama bin Laden?
President Obama is always looking for a balance of some sort, right? And so he came into office having criticized President Bush in his war on terror in pretty sharp terms, not just Iraq, but surveillance and drones and the military tribunals and Guantanamo and all these things. But what he was criticizing was really Bush first term. Bush second term had actually changed a lot of these things. So that by the time President Obama takes office, he doesn't actually make as big a pivot as you would have thought from the campaign trail. Yes, he signs an order banning torture, but the truth is they had stopped waterboarding at the end of Bush's first term. They hadn't done it in the second term. Yes, he signed an order to close Guantanamo, but actually President Bush had moved out more detainees from Guantanamo during his final 2 years than President Obama would in his 8 years. Now, he left him the hardest cases, so I'm not trying to make a point. But my point is that Bush was actually moving in the direction that Obama would later take that war on terror. So he adopted a lot of what Bush left him, including surveillance, as Edward Snowden would later show us, and kept a lot of it. He got a lot of grief from the ACLU about that. At the same time, he was getting a lot of grief from Dick Cheney, who thought he was going too far in undoing what President Bush had done. So he was constantly struggling to find what he thought was his balance. I don't think he ever fully felt comfortable with it. But once you're in the Oval Office, it looks different than on the campaign trail. You could be on the campaign trail and criticize the president, but when you're in the Oval Office and you're the guy they bring the intelligence report to every day, say, here, Mr. President, are the 100 ways bad guys are trying to kill Americans today, and you have to stop. That's a big, big burden on your shoulders. And I think he was more willing to accept some of the things that President Bush had done, not to say the Iraq War, but on the terrorism front, than he had been as a candidate.
Do you remember, as a New York Times reporter, what you were doing when Osama bin Laden got killed, and
I do.
And tell us about that and how?
Yeah, I was at home at night. I guess most people were at home at night. I was actually on book leave, working on a book about Bush, but I got a call from one of our photographers, a guy named Doug Mills, who's a fantastic photographer. And if you do pick up this book that we've done, it's a picture book with some bad text, but some really great photos by Doug and some of the other photographers. And Doug called me and said, something's going on. Something's happening. I think they got bin Laden. I said, why do you have that? Yeah, I just think they got bin Laden. He'd heard from a Secret Service guy that something big was happening. Doug is better sourced than any of the reporters. And so I start calling, making calls. Helene Cooper, my colleague, starts making calls. And we get it confirmed just before he goes out to make the announcement that that's what they're going to do. And then I'm in my jammies in my bed, typing on the computer, and after the first version of the story goes up online, I throw on clothes and run to the office to then write the with Helene, the story for the print editions that would follow. And it was remarkable because even from our bureau, which is a few blocks from the White House, you could hear this chanting on Pennsylvania Avenue outside the White House. People were so excited. It's such an exuberant moment, you know. They were chanting things like CIA, CIA. When do you hear that, right? That's not your usual chant by students in the streets, right? They were in USA, USA is more common, but there was a visceral sense that something big had happened. And what's remarkable, of course, is how it brought the country together, and within, let's say, 48 hours, it was over. You know, President Obama's approval numbers went up to about 60-some%, highest I think he had in his presidency, and within a week or two or three, we were back to our normal politics.
Well, we got Osama bin Laden, thank God, but the problems in the Middle East continued, and Syria came to become a very dominant part of his two-term presidency. How was he kind of entrapped in the Syrian morass, and how do you think he fared with that?
Yeah, I think he would tell you probably that Syria was the big gaping hole of his presidency where he wished he could have done more. He failed to do what he would have liked to do. It doesn't mean he would necessarily do things different. I think he would still make the argument today that there wasn't a better solution than he found, but nobody can argue that the outcome was a success. That was obviously not 500,000 dead, millions displaced, and so on. And I think you have to understand Syria, you have to go to Libya. Why is that? Libya in 2011, Gaddafi is threatening massacres of rebels and civilians in Benghazi where they are resisting his rule. And President Obama is talked into intervening. And he wasn't really happy about it, but he decided to go along with it, convinced by Hillary Clinton, convinced by the Europeans that this was the right thing to do. And you know, there was an altruistic reason, right? We want to stop what could be thousands of deaths. But he was always ambivalent about it, and that ambivalence came through. Remember the famous phrase, leading from behind? That's where that phrase came from in a New Yorker article that came describing his policy in Libya. Well, leading from behind has never really worked for the United States. That's not been he says it's been misunderstood, fine. But that concept became attached to his foreign policy. And he was so uninterested in repeating what he saw as the debacle of Iraq that he left a different kind of debacle in Libya, right? They ended up displacing Gaddafi, and instead there was a mess and chaos on the ground that ultimately would lead to the Benghazi attack that killed 4 Americans and hurt Hillary Clinton's political future as well. He didn't want us to be involved there, so the minute we finished the initial mission, we got out. And he was so burned by the ultimate result, he decided, I'm not going to do that again. And that what comes next is Syria. We don't want to have in Syria what happened in Libya. So he was even more resistant to the idea of American intervention of any sort. That doesn't mean necessarily American troops would have gone into Syria, but there are plenty of middle grounds. But he often presented the choice as if it was between doing nothing or doing a full-scale Iraq invasion a la President Bush. And a lot of advisors of his and a lot of critics of his said, well, wait a second, there are some middle ground things here where we could do. We could have to impact, at least try to stop some of the slaughter. And he was very reluctant. He had a policy that came out of this period. He described it to us one day on the back of Air Force One. It was off the record, but later was reported, so I can tell you now. The policy basically boiled down to 4 words. Pardon my French. It was, don't do stupid shit. And his view was it was stupid shit to get ourselves involved in Syria. And I think that defined the way he looked at it.
What about world leaders? Is there somebody you think he got along with particularly well if you were going to do a dual biography of Obama and somebody? And then conversely, where did he not have chemistry with a world leader?
That's a great question. On the first, nobody jumps to mind. I don't think he really, he was friendly well enough with, the David Camerons and so forth. Angela Merkel wasn't all that happy. Remember, she was bugging. She was being bugged by him, literally, her phone. He got along well with Dmitry Medvedev, who for a time was the president of Russia, even while Putin was still pulling the strings as prime minister. You'll remember he slipped out of the presidency to formally obey the constitutional term limit. Medvedev had at least some rope to play with, and he found some connection with. But I remember doing a story once saying, he doesn't really have warm relations with any foreign leaders. And, I got yelled at by the staff, the Obama staff, how could you say that? Okay, well, name one for me. He said, well, and they really couldn't. They said, the leader of South Korea, they've had a conversation or two. It just wasn't his thing, right? Other presidents personalized foreign policy, nobody more than George H.W. Bush, right? He had friends in every palace and presidential house in the world. Clinton certainly did that to an extent. Bush certainly did that to an extent. That just wasn't Obama's thing. It just didn't, it wasn't the way he rolled.
And what about an adversarial relationship that you ever detected?
Well, certainly Putin, right? He and Putin did not get along, let's say. They remember, of course, he said Putin was like that kid slouching in the back of the classroom, kind of like this, and he wasn't. That didn't go over very well in Moscow, but Putin had about the same amount of respect for Obama, so it's fair. I think Putin decided early on that Obama was weak, that he could roll him. He didn't have much respect for him, and he acted accordingly. And so the two of them were never going to be friends.
What about Netanyahu? How did?
Oh yeah, another one. Yeah, they do that. They're not going to invite Netanyahu to the reunions, I don't think, and vice versa. For some reason, from the very start, they just talked past each other. Netanyahu was convinced that Obama was naive about the Middle East, that when Obama talked about Palestinian aspirations and the desire to reach out to the Arab and the Muslim world after the Bush term, that he didn't know what he was talking about, that he didn't take Iran seriously enough. And so from Netanyahu's point of view, Obama was terrible. And Obama felt pretty similar about Netanyahu. He thought Netanyahu was a hardliner who was unwilling to make any concessions toward peace, who was just locked into an old paradigm and never going to be shaken out of it.
Last foreign policy question. He had two secretaries of state, Hillary Clinton and then John Kerry. What was his relationship like with each of them?
It's a great question. I mean, the relationship with Clinton, you talk about a buddy book, and this is historians like Doug and I, as I would like to pretend to be, love buddy books, two historical figures and how they got along or didn't get along. If there was one to be done, my colleague Mark Landler did one on Obama and Clinton, because here these two had been extraordinary rivals through this very bitter, tough, hard-fought Democratic campaign. And then he gave her the most important slot he had to give other than the vice presidency. And I think they ended up becoming, forging a genuine relationship, a genuine friendship. Early on, she was nervous and insecure about her place in the cabinet. You saw that in some of those emails that were later released. He didn't have a lot of respect for the Clintons early on. But over time, I think that changed. He came to respect her. She came to respect him. They were there for those tough meetings in the Situation Room. He came to realize that Bill Clinton had something to offer, because he too had been through a shellacking in a midterm election and somehow found a way to come back. So by the time they left office, I think the two of them were actually much closer. And in fact, he cleared the way for her. Now, some people would say that was a mistake of his, that he should have groomed some other Democratic candidate to be his successor rather than Hillary Clinton. And they should have made room for more candidates, whether it be Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden or somebody else. But he did basically put his chips down on her being his successor. John Kerry and he, I don't think were quite as close, but they respected each other. John Kerry, remember, gave him his first start on the national stage by giving him that keynote slot in the 2004 convention. With Kerry, it was a little bit more like Kerry was always running off trying to actually solve things. And sometimes the White House didn't necessarily want him to do that. Somebody famously compared it to that movie Gravity, where Sandra Bullock is off sort of barely tethered to the spaceship, right? And that was John Kerry. Sometimes he wasn't necessarily tethered. But I think Obama came to respect Kerry's sort of Energizer Bunny, determination to get something done. And he basically says, okay, John, you want to go try it? Fine. And he let him do it. The problem is that people knew that, right? And if you see a Secretary of State come into your place to negotiate peace, and you think he doesn't really have the commitment of the president, are you really going to start making the concessions you need to do to make that? Not as often. Iran deal obviously was the big accomplishment that John Kerry had. We're going to have an announcement tomorrow as to whether it will continue to exist. As of 2 p.m. tomorrow, President Trump is going to tell us what he's going to do with it. A lot of criticism of that deal by Democrats as well as Republicans. But it would not have happened, I think, but for John Kerry's personal energy and investment of time in it.
The big legacy piece, it looks like, is going to be the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and he went on to embrace the name. I'm proud, call it Obamacare. How much capital did he use in that first year to make that the signature progressive achievement?
Yeah, almost all of it, right? I mean, he put everything, he put his whole presidency basically on that. Remember, he got the stimulus in 17 days. So he had that out of the way, and then basically invested the next 13 months entirely in healthcare, to the point that he cost arguably his party the control of the House in the midterms in 2010. And it was a kind of hodgepodge, Rube Goldberg contraption to some extent, in which he was trying to make everybody happy and made probably nobody happy. And then once they got it passed, for all of the blood they put into it, and as proud as they felt at that moment, they kind of abandoned the baby, and they didn't sell it. The polls came back negative. They decided it was a political loser. They said, well, we should talk about other things. And so rather than sell it and keep pushing, to tell the country why it was great, he sort of moved on to other things. And obviously the disaster of the launch of the website at the beginning only sort of encouraged this idea that it was a flawed program. Now, President Trump has vowed to get rid of it. He failed, but he has undone parts of it. And the question then becomes, where does it go from here? The mandate part is gone. The individual mandate is gone. Some of the subsidies have not been renewed. I'm not an expert on the healthcare system, but what President Obama's people would tell you is, look, history zigs and zags. So we might have moved a lot, 3 steps forward with this. Trump took us a step back, but the next president may take us back forward again, and at least we got somewhere down the road. But I think he was very proud of that accomplishment. Toward the end of his presidency, he came back to it. And I think that some of the polls now show there's more support for it now, when it's under threat from President Trump, than there was when President Obama was actually in office.
And it gave birth to the Tea Party movement.
It did.
And maybe not just the Tea Party, Peter, but what about the kind of counter-narrative here that by being the first African-American, it created a kind of backlash syndrome, and by doing Obamacare quickly? What was the opposition? How do you think history is going to view the anti-Obama opposition of his presidency?
I think you're right about the Tea Party. The Tea Party, arguably, by the way, has its origins with Bush, right? Bush was not a small government conservative. He was a big government conservative. And conservatives were mad about that, but kind of tamped it down while he was in office because he was a Republican. But remember, he expanded Medicare with Part D. He wanted immigration reform. He spent money on AIDS in Africa. I mean, Bush was much more of an activist than people remember, and more of an activist than a lot of libertarian conservatives wanted him to be. When Obama came in, they were liberated to be angry and to express that anger. And Obama played into it in the sense that he was a big government liberal, right? $800 billion stimulus program, government-run health care, Wall Street reforms, environmental regulation, and so on and so forth. So, that's the birth of the Tea Party. That's the birth then of Sarah Palin. Arguably, that's plays into today with Donald Trump. And you'll have people debate as to how much that's Obama's fault or how much it's just a function of Republican obstructionism. He would tell you it's obstructionism, of course. There are those, including people who work for him, who thought he could have actually tried to work with Republicans a little bit more. I was very struck one time. I interviewed him in late 2010 when they were just on the verge of losing the House. And we were talking about the stimulus package. I said, well, what do you think you could have done differently? He says, well, one mistake I made was not letting the Republicans argue to get tax cuts in the stimulus program. Now, the stimulus program actually had tax cuts in it. It was a 3-part thing. There was help for localities which needed help in the recession. There was public spending, what we think of New Deal type programs, public works, and then there was tax cuts, temporary tax cuts to try to stimulate spending. But he told the Republicans, here are the tax cuts I'm giving you. And the Republicans didn't want to be told that they were going to get tax cuts. They wanted to argue for tax cuts and win tax cuts, and then they would have ownership over it. And that was sort of a tactical mistake. President Obama often thought he knew what the other guy should want, and therefore gave it to them, was his version of what they should want, rather than seeing that the process is a give and take in which the other side has to have some ownership by winning part of the argument.
Very interesting point. I had never thought about it that way. Tell me about Michelle Obama, beloved First Lady. What was her trajectory like during her 8 years in the White House, and what do you think she's going to be remembered for as First Lady?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, obviously she had her program she cared about in terms of healthy eating and exercise and this families of soldiers and so forth. She didn't want to be in the White House. I mean, I think she made that pretty clear. She didn't really try to hide it very much. This is not her idea of a good life. She felt very burned, I think, by the campaign and some of the, what she thought was misinterpretations of some of the things she had said. And she kind of retreated early on and didn't use her platform as much as she could have because she didn't like having been the scar tissue that she had from 2008. By the second term, you began to see her speak out a little bit more. I went to a commencement address she gave in Chicago where she talked much more openly about how early on she was so mad about the slings and arrows that come with that position, and the race part of that bothered her a lot. She did not go unnoticed in her household that she was called Obama's baby mama on Fox News. It did not go unnoticed in her house that the New Yorker put her on the cover, dressed in an afro and doing a power punch or whatever, power fist, and those things bothered her a lot. And she talked about it openly in the second term about how long it took her to kind of get past that and move forward. She used it as a way of trying to inspire young people not to let things get them down. She has a great speaking capacity, as we've seen, right? The 2016 convention, her speech was better probably than anybody else's there. But she does not want, people always say, why? Yeah, maybe she'll run for office. She does not want to run for office.
Yeah.
I remember being with President Obama in Omaha toward the end, and somebody was shouting at him, 4 more years, and he says, there are 2 problems with that, he says. One is the Constitution, and the other Michelle.
Yeah, no, that's she did a remarkable job of raising her daughters in that kind of
in a hot house environment, not pleasant, not fun.
Yeah. Now I wanted to get at.
And I think, by the way, that's one accomplishment you would say it's sort of it's hard for historians to get at, right? But 8 years in the White House, a successful, scandal-free, for the most part, presidency in terms of their personal thing.
Yeah.
A functional, happy family, right? That looked right out of Norman Rockwell, but for an African American family, right? As an inspiration. My son is 13. The only president he knew, basically, growing up, was an African American president, and it didn't seem unusual to him. That's the way that seemed perfectly normal to him. And I think that Valerie Jarrett has made this point that is sort of the unspoken accomplishment, is simply being there, doing the job, being judged for good or bad on the policies that worked or didn't work, being criticized the way he ought to be criticized for the things he did wrong, but just simply being a president there, day in, day out, showing that this is not an unusual thing.
We often judge presidents as whether they get reelected. So he's a 2-termer.
Yep.
I mean, we can consider the age of Obama. How close was Mitt Romney to winning? If there was a moment that seemed to be neck and neck, and what do you think was the breakthrough for Obama's ability to win re-election?
The real key for them, a couple of keys. One is every incumbent president who's lost in the last century had a primary challenge. Okay, Lyndon Johnson was forced out of the race. Gerald Ford was challenged by Reagan. Jimmy Carter by Kennedy. George H.W. Bush by Pat Buchanan. Is that cause or effect? I don't know, but it shows you how important it is to lock up your own party first. He did that. He made sure the Democrats, as disenchanted as some of them were, because a lot of liberals were unhappy with him. They didn't think he went far enough. They didn't think he lived up to the promise that he had offered. He locked up the party first. That was first. Second was, early on, they defined Mitt Romney as a wealthy Bain Capital, rapacious, figure. It's ironic because, of course, Mitt Romney is nowhere near the wealthy figure that Donald Trump is, right? And that didn't bother people about Donald Trump. But Donald Trump had, private planes, and he loved showing off his wealth, and this was, seen as a benefit for him. But Romney was embarrassed by it, I think, to some extent. I think that the Obama people successfully made it into a liability for him. Rather than being a successful businessman, they portrayed him as something other than that. They did that in the spring. They didn't wait until fall. But there was still a moment where Romney could have won. He made a very good case for himself at that first debate. President Obama did not, by his own admission. Romney came across as smart and thoughtful and assertive without being overly aggressive. And coming out of that Denver debate, it could have been anybody's race. Now, then President Obama kind of got his jets going again and came back in the second debate, and by that point it was over. But it definitely could have turned out a different way.
We're going to now take some of the questions from the audience. And one is, in your opinion, what did Obama talk to Donald Trump about in their first private Oval Office meeting? Do you have any scoop on that?
Would you like to have like the thought bubbles for that one? They had never met until that moment. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. For years, right, Trump had been like dogging him on this birther stuff, and and Obama kind of gave as good as he got at that White House Correspondents' dinner, remember, where he mocked him? They had never met until that moment in 2016 after the election, and he hosted him in the Oval Office. And it was an extraordinary day because if you walked through the White House that day, it was like walking through a funeral home. I mean, the people were in tears. Not Obama, but the people around him were just flabbergasted. They still couldn't believe it. And who was this guy who was showing up in our White House? But the guy who had basically engaged in this very racially incendiary campaign against President Obama for so many years. President Obama, keeps his feelings tight, and I think he had a civilized meeting with President Trump. He talked about North Korea, we understand. That's the thing he told him he would have to worry about the most. It was, in theory, at least a civil conversation. Both came out saying nice things about each other. And that was the last time the two of them said nice things about each other. Ever since then, of course, he's been pretty quiet, but he speaks up from time to time.
That leads into a North Korea question. They're wondering, do you consider Obama's policy towards North Korea weak, naive, and ineffective?
It was almost non-existent. I mean, he basically decided, I'm going to ignore North Korea for 8 years and hope at some point something happens that changes the dynamics that allow me to do something. He decided not to even bother. Rightly or wrongly, he came in after Bush tried. Bush, the hardliner, made a real serious effort at making peace with North Korea and actually came close to a deal. The North Koreans even blew up that cooling tower and promised to get rid of their nuclear program. Ultimately, it all fell apart. So Obama came in and said, well, I don't want to waste my time like Bush did. I don't want to be in the same position. I'm basically going to ignore it. But in the process of ignoring it, of course, North Korea simply accumulated more and more nuclear weapons, got further and further on its ballistic testing. Now, I'm not saying they didn't do anything. They did have a secret sabotage program. They tried to hold back the North Korean program through CIA and NSA type methods that we don't fully understand. But broadly, he decided not to try to engage. President Trump, like him or not, agree with him or not, has decided that he was going to take it on straight on. Now, that may work or it may not. But he decided it wasn't something that could be punted down the field. And he's not wrong to say that the last three presidents, have left this big mess on his doorstep. It is a mess. And I have no idea whether he's going to be able to solve it or not.
All right. Another foreign affairs related question. Some people argue that foreign leaders just did not really fear Obama. Do you think that's a valid criticism of Obama's foreign policy?
That's a fair point in some cases. I definitely don't think Putin feared him. I think actually Putin was surprised in 2014 when he annexed Crimea and intervened in eastern Ukraine, how successfully Obama and the Europeans managed to stick together and impose sanctions and didn't break apart. I think Putin thought he could break apart America and Europe on that, and he failed. So I think in that way Obama was tougher probably than he had imagined. But yeah, I think in general there are some people like Putin and Assad who took Obama's measure, and they didn't think that he was particularly fearsome. What Obama would say is, ask Gaddafi, ask bin Laden, he was plenty tough. But he didn't project that. That wasn't what he tried to do. He was a hyper-rational person. He didn't want to project toughness, right? He saw that as shallow. He wanted to be able to connect with foreign leaders to solve problems. And I think he came into office genuinely believing that if I sit down with Bibi Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas, of course we can solve Middle East peace. Because we're rational people, and this ought to be solved. And as appealing as that is, that's just not the way it worked.
Very good. Why does it seem like Trump is trying to dismantle everything Obama built during his presidency?
I think it seems like that because it's true. No, it is. There's no question. If it has an O on it, he's taking a sledgehammer to it. And every president comes in, even ones of the same party, trying to show a different direction than the person he succeeded, right? And eventually she will succeed. That's natural. But what's unnatural is I don't think actually Ronald Reagan spent a lot of time actually trying to undo the things Jimmy Carter did. He simply tried to say, here's where I'm going to take the country. And that's the same, I think, for Bill Clinton when he came in after George H.W. Bush. And I think George W. Bush after he came in from Clinton. They didn't like the policies of their predecessors, but they didn't spend their time trying to undo them, right? President Trump has tried to undo a lot, if not most, of what President Obama did on obviously health care, obviously on environmental regulations, Wall Street regulations. There has been on Cuba policy, on the Iran deal, on TPP, on Paris. I don't think we've ever seen it that I can think of anyway, and you're the expert. I can't think of a president who spent so much time undoing things that the last president did, as opposed to setting new policies for himself.
Very true. What major contribution did Obama make to Black lives? Anything other than the image?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I speak as a pretty pale dude, so other people are better probably positioned to answer that question than I am. But I think let's not underestimate just being there. But I also think that he empowered a new generation of younger African American politicians to believe that they can in fact succeed. Now that doesn't mean that it's been what people expected. I think we all had unrealistic expectations in 2008 that his election meant, we finally lanced that boil. We have a country that was born in slavery and has struggled with Jim Crow, and that we have finally made it. We haven't made it. It was one step along the road, but it did not solve our racial problems. And what's most depressing, I think, for a lot of people is that if you look at the polls at the end of his presidency, the racial divide was actually larger than it was when he came in. And I think he's depressed by that. I think he finds that disappointing. And why was that? Was he polarizing? Was it a revival of white grief and anger and grievance? Many of those things are probably true, and it's hard to sort of sum up in a short conversation that we're having here. But I think that one of the clear disappointments was this idea that we were heading into a post-racial society. It didn't materialize.
Great. When asked, President Obama said that he thought what keeps him awake at night the most is fierce partisanship, our kind of neo-civil war that's going on now. What's your opinion of that?
Well, and he said himself that his big regret, and he said in his last State of the Union, his big regret is the failure to bridge that divide. Remember, he was going to be a bridge builder. I think he wanted to be. I think that was his nature. I think that is his instinct. But for whatever reason, he was, until now, according to polls, the most polarizing president we'd had. George W. Bush was the most polarizing until Obama came along. So in other words, it may be the people, but it also may be our times. Remember, President Obama inherited a country in which most people did not think we were on the right track, according to polls, and they stayed that way throughout his presidency. We were a sour country under Bush, and we were a sour country under Obama, and our divide has widened, and he failed to bridge that. Could he have done more? I'll leave that to others to say, but I think it was one of his big disappointments, and one of the things where the promise of 2008, which was so inspiring, clearly it didn't fulfill itself.
We have 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. And I'm going to compress a few into what this, because there's interest among you all about what Obama thinks of Donald Trump. And
he thinks what you think he thinks.
Yeah, that's. Yeah, so why don't we take that? Do you foresee him? He's working on a memoir right now, and do you think that some people wishes he was more engaged of being a critic of Donald Trump? Does it surprise you that he's not in the public arena a little more than he is?
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, are disappointed. Democrats are eager for a voice out there to be their champion, and they don't have one right now because Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, none of these folks is able to command the stage the way a former president could, and President Obama's chosen not to. And I think he's chosen not to for two big reasons. One is I think he respected the way George W. Bush handled the post-presidency when he was in office. George W. Bush, of course, famously said, I'm not going to criticize my successor. I know how hard it is to be in the Oval Office. I'm not going to do that. And he, by and large, lived up to that. And I think President Obama appreciated that. He thought that was a gracious and honorable thing to do, and he wanted to do the same for his successor. Now, he expected his successor to be somebody different. And it would have been a lot easier for him to do that if it was Hillary Clinton. And it would have been easier for him to do that if it was Jeb Bush, too. Trump challenges that instinct on his part, because I think he does feel strongly about some of these things. But I think he's also come to the conclusion that if he were to be out there speaking more, if he were to present himself as that leader, one, you wouldn't have a Democratic Party develop a new generation, and you need somebody to come along. It can't just be the last. Two, President Trump wants him to do that, right? President Trump does best when he has a foil. He does best when he has an enemy to play off of. He wants to have somebody to play off of. He's still talking about Hillary Clinton. Why? Because he needs somebody to play off of, and the Democrats haven't given him anybody else. Why does he talk about the fake news media so much? Because we are a convenient adversary as far as he is concerned. By the way, we don't view ourselves that way. We are not the opposition. I always say that because we don't want to play into that role. Unfortunately, both liberals and President Trump sometimes want us to be the opposition, not our role. Our role is to be independent part of society. Now that's the end of that commercial break. But I think President Obama realizes that if he gets up and speaks and criticizes President Trump a lot, that's what President Trump wants, because he has somebody to play back against. And he doesn't want to make it about himself. He wants President Trump to fail of his own design and not help him out by giving him an enemy.
Last question, which comes from one of these cards. But what's the takeaway of 8 years of Barack Obama? What do you consider his greatest achievement that he was able to accomplish? You've touched on it probably already, but you might want to nail it here at the end for us.
I think his presidency is about hopes. It's about the hopes that we had for him, the hopes he realized, and the hopes that were dashed. And I think that because he came into office with such unrealistically high expectations, and because he inspired so many people, including Republicans, I genuinely think a lot of Republicans who voted against him were still nonetheless inspired by his election and hoped that he would be what he seemed to be in their view, and he wasn't in their view. But obviously, bringing the economy back from the brink is going to be big in his chapter in history. You can't overlook that. I think, again, being the first African American president, having a 8 strong years in the White House without personal scandal is you can't underestimate that. I think what he would argue is he pulled back and got us out of Iraq for the most part, even though we had to go back in a small way, not a small way, but in a less robust way. I think that the healthcare thing continues to be his pride, and I think he thinks that it will still survive in some form. It will be rescued and adjusted. The setbacks or the disappointments, the failings, anybody would say Syria was not a success. I think, he did leave a foreign policy that was, in some cases successful, but in other cases muddled. His failure to follow through on the red line threat on chemical weapons soured a lot of foreign leaders toward him and toward the United States by virtue of the fact that we didn't follow up on our word. I think that we just talked about the failure to bridge the divide. Maybe nobody could have done it. I don't mean to put it all on his shoulders, but that was clearly an unrealized hope of his presidency. And now we have a chance. He's a young ex-president, so his legacy, I think, is still yet to be fully written. He has a lot of years to come, and I'm really looking forward to his book and hope his book is honest and candid, because I'm really interested to hear what he has to say and his observations now that he's no longer a politician, but an ex-politician.
Thank you so much, Peter Baker, New York Times. Amazing. Really well done.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.